Representatives from key regional powers across the Middle East have arrived in Pakistan to hold talks on ending the month-long war. But as discussions kick off, fighting between the warring parties continues. A number of Gulf states say their air defenses have responded to Iranian missile and drone strikes. Israel continues hitting targets deep inside Iran, and reports of the US possibly deploying ground troops are increasing.
Israel and the US continue to strike Iran as the war enters its second month, with Iran's capital, Tehran, bearing the brunt of the attacks. The Israel Defense Forces released this graphic to illustrate the targets that they say they've hit, including ballistic missile production and storage facilities, as well as aerial defense systems and observation points in Tehran. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, top diplomats from various regional powers have arrived to discuss ways and means to bring this war to an end. There are calls for an end to the war in Tel Aviv, too. Protests there ended in violence, with Israeli media reporting police arrested 22 people as they tried to break up the demonstration. In the U.S., word from the Trump administration is that the war will soon be over.
Well, the president said, look, we've accomplished the gross majority of our military objectives. I think you can make a good argument we've accomplished all of our military objectives. The president's going to keep at it for a little while longer to ensure that once we leave, we don't have to do this again for a very, very long time. I think the president's been very clear about this, that we're not interested in being in Iran a year down the road, 2 years down the road. We're taking care of business. We're going to be out of there soon, and gas prices are going to come back down.
But the regime in Tehran doesn't believe the message from Washington. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf accused the U.S. of publicly sending messages of negotiation and dialogue, while secretly planning a ground attack. For its part, U.S. Central Command has confirmed that 3,500 amphibious forces have arrived in the theater of operations. And the Washington Post newspaper says it has been told by several unnamed government sources that the Pentagon is preparing for weeks of ground operations in Iran.
And we're joined now by Robert Pape. He's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, specializing in international security affairs, in particular the use of force and political violence. And on his Substack Escalation Trap, he recently shared how a limited war turns into a global disaster. I would guess that he was also referring to the current war in the Middle East, but we'll be talking about that now. Good to have you on the program. You've been studying air power for more than 30 years, and you found that dropping bombs on a country doesn't necessarily lead to a regime change. Why not?
It is a self-defeating strategy politically. What we found since World War I is, in case after case, air power can be used to hit targets tactically, and with precision bombs, 80–90% of the time tactically successful, and then also kill leaders. The problem is when you have a foreign military power intercede in the politics of a country, the tension between society and government, that changes the political game inside of a country, so that you don't just get the regime hardening and becoming more nationalist, the entire country becomes more nationalist. Even the pro-democracy movements, they still don't like their government, but they don't want to be a puppet to a foreign military power.
So why then is air bombardment still the main military strategy time and again?
Because it's cheap in terms of lives. It is, if you just look at how this campaign has opened, in the opening days of the war, only 20% of Americans even knew we were bombing Iran. And the reason is because the air attacks have very little risk to our troops. There is some risk to pilots, some risk with the logistics, but as of now, we've had approximately 13 Americans killed. That's the same number killed when we withdrew from Afghanistan. So what you are seeing is it's incredibly seductive to try to use air power, even though the record is brutal. History has been brutal to this strategy of air power alone toppling governments. And what it does is it tends to get countries in a trap, because the opponent lashes back, doesn't just sit there and take it. They lash back, and now Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil, more than any other country on the planet.
So this escalation trap, as you name it also, if I understand you correctly, it's part of that escalation trap is that you start a military operation based on false expectations, like, for example, targeting Iran's nuclear sites last year and then announcing they're obliterated, but they aren't. Why weren't they?
You've got it exactly right. And when you go down those roads of false expectations and false promises to your public, so just keep in mind, President Trump didn't just have false expectations ahead of the bombing of Fordow last June. He then said the whole program was obliterated. Well, now he's setting up enormous political costs as he goes forward. That is part of the politics. So my role has been to study not just bombs on target, but how the bombs, when they get involved, they change the politics inside of the target country, and they change the politics inside of the attacking country. You see both on display here, sucking America into what I call stage 3, the ground dilemma. We haven't crossed into ground operations yet, but you can see as we have failed strategically, as Iran has lashed back, we're now sucked into doing something we never thought we would do, boots on the ground, and probably casualties with those boots on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, part of the strategy, or at least that's what we were told, was to take out the supreme leader of Iran. Well, US and Israel managed to do that, but that didn't end the regime there, as we know. The Trump administration, however, including J.D. Vance just in the report earlier, keeps insisting that they pretty much achieved all their military objectives. Do you think that this is an attempt for them to get out of that trap?
No, they're spinning this for domestic political consumption, primarily, a little bit of European public consumption, secondarily. What you're seeing is our politicians, and this is true in Europe as well, they're masters of PR. They're masters of spinning. I call this victory rhetoric is meeting escalation reality. So side by side with all the talk, the war's over, nothing to see here, we are moving ground forces in. In fact, the Marines, 2,500, just arrived a couple days ago. And at that point, the Pentagon has already announced publicly in the media it's looking to put in not just more Marines, but over and above that, another 10,000, bringing the total, if this all goes forward, to 17,000 ground forces in the next few weeks. So we need to really track what the movement of the forces, not just listen to the spinning of politicians.
Now, you mentioned those ground troops there, and we can see how it keeps growing. It certainly looks like it's going in the direction, but at the same time, we have these peace talks, if you like, or ceasefire talks going on. So let's just say that the US and Iran strike some sort of deal, that Trump is able to declare victory, the regime in Iran continues to exist. Would that solve the problem?
Well, it's going to leave, if that were to be the case, you would not have the ground forces go forward, but now you have a dilemma, which is Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. It is now in control of more oil than any other country. The United States would be number 2, but Iran number 1. And that has geopolitical leverage. Oil is power. It is not simply energy. And that power you can already see is exerted with, say, India. So India now is paying for its ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. You can now see that with Pakistan, which gave Iran its centrifuges 25 years ago to start the nuclear enrichment program, is now trying to gain political power for itself as we go forward here. So what you are going to see is if Iran is an oil hegemon over the coming months, they will put pressure on Iraq, Bahrain. They'll start to try to fracture the Gulf state coalition. And I doubt they're going to let Saudi Arabia and UAE ship their oil through the Gulf. That's almost 20% of their GDP. That's a gigantic loss for them as Iran is gaining power.
I wanted to ask you about some good news, but I think I'd rather drop it. Robert Pape, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we're turning to another part in the Middle East now, embroiled in the conflict. 3 journalists in Lebanon have been killed in Israeli strikes on the country's south. On Sunday, mourners gathered for the funerals in Beirut, chanting anti-Israeli and anti-American chants. Lebanese authorities have condemned the killings as war crimes, while Israel alleges that one of the reporters was also a member of a Hezbollah combat unit. And I'm joined now by Kristian Brakel. He's the regional representative at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Lebanon. You recently evacuated from there, but you know the region very well. Before that position, previous to that position, you were a representative of the same foundation in Istanbul. Your Middle Eastern studies took you to Syria, to Egypt, to Israel. So with all of that background knowledge, what do you make of those recent escalations between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon?
I think it's very clear that Israel, after the events of October 7th, 2 years ago, has come to a new conclusion how to deal with all these regional threats. And this is that whatever it takes and whatever it means for the different countries like Lebanon, if there is regional chaos or not, it doesn't concern Israel. It's better and it makes its own borders more safer, and these security threats from an Israeli perspective, in this case Hezbollah, have to be dealt with very forcefully, no matter what it means for the civilian population in that country.
But Israel seems to somehow really wanting to end the story of Hezbollah. Is that possible?
I don't think it's realistic, but what they maybe can get is like degrading its arsenal, its possibilities to operate for a very, very long time. I mean, what we've also seen is like Israeli not doing it themselves. I mean, yes, they're bombing Hezbollah, they're fighting Hezbollah on the ground, but in the end, they are also trying to pressure the Lebanese population, the Lebanese government, to do what they can't do themselves, and that is to go into an intense conflict with Hezbollah itself to take their weapons away from them. So I think they're afraid that they can't do it themselves, but I'm afraid the Lebanese government can also not do it.
Before we talk about what the Lebanese government can do and cannot do, let's just talk about those 3 journalists that were killed. Now, as we mentioned, Lebanese authorities are talking of war crimes, while Israel says, well, at least one of them was a member of a Hezbollah combat unit. Can that be verified?
I think that is a big problem. I mean, of course, I don't know if he was in Hezbollah or not, but I think it follows a certain pattern that we already have seen in Gaza and then also in other territories and other wars that Israel led. Time and again, not only journalists, but also medical personnel is targeted. And then the Israelis say, but look, they were involved in some kind of military activity. But rarely is there any proof for that. And I think also, what does it mean that he was in Hezbollah? Because he was not fighting at that moment. He was not wearing a uniform. He was not carrying a weapon. Maybe he was part of an Hezbollah. There are Hezbollah-affiliated media units, but that doesn't make him a target. Same as, for example, Deutsche Welle is not an outlet of the German government and would not be a legitimate target in a war.
So the claim that it was a war crime would be justified?
I think from all that we know so far, it would be justified.
What about the relationship between, let's call them ordinary Lebanese and members of the Hezbollah? Is there some kind of cooperation? Is the majority supporting Hezbollah, or is Hezbollah actually taking them hostage?
I think you have a mix. There was a lot of criticism, even among the Shiite community, like traditionally supporting population, or like from which Hezbollah gets its support. There was a lot of criticism when Hezbollah started this war with Israel, or restarted the war with Israel, saying like, we can't win this, you can't win this, you are dragging us into the second war in just 2 years. Why? And just on the behest of Iran. We don't want that. But we have a lot of people, especially in the Shiite community, who still might be critical of Hezbollah for doing that, but that doesn't mean that they support in any way what the Israelis are doing. And also, I think the majority of Lebanese are just tired of both sides. They don't want to be held hostage by Hezbollah, but they also don't see why the Israelis should again invade what is a sovereign neighboring state.
Yeah. So, because there isn't one voice, is that the reason why the government of Lebanon is basically not capable of basically serving one or the other and disarming Hezbollah, for example?
I think that it's part of the explanation, but in the end, I mean, you have to look at Lebanon's history after the civil war. We have a very political system that is fraught with problems, that's split along sectarian lines. And of course, you have an army that also was never built as an army to defend a sovereign state, but more as something to hold together as good as it can some things domestically. And they just lack the possibilities. Plus, there is, of course, the fear that civil war could return, because we have 20% Shiites also within the Lebanese army.
All right, well... fascinating and sad at the same time, of course. Kristian Brakel there, regional representative at Heinrich Böll Foundation in Lebanon. Thank you so very much for your time and your insights.
Joining us is Fawaz Gerges, professor of Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. Fawaz, welcome. Now, we heard Vice President J.D. Vance there, but also, of course, the U.S. appears to continue to reinforce its military posture in the region. Iran must prepare for escalation scenarios such as American ground troops. What do we know about Tehran's thinking and preparation right now?
I think the Iranians expect a ground invasion or a ground operations. The head of the parliament, Mohammad Khalifah, as he said the United States, President Trump, is engaged in deceptive diplomacy, while he is sending more troops in order to carry out ground operations. And more importantly, what Khalifah said, he said this is going to be a very complex, very costly, very difficult path. And we need to be prepared for that. So what he was sending a message to the Iranian people is that this is going to be very bloody, very complex, and we have to be prepared for that. And what we know about Iran in the past 4 weeks, the Iranians have been preparing for the American-Israeli war for a long time. They have decentralized the decision-making process. They have empowered commanders and lieutenants in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards to take action. And actually, the Iranian regime, despite everything that has happened, it has shown resilience and it has been dynamic and adaptive. So, yeah, I expect the Iranians to be highly prepared, in particular when it comes to ground forces, because really they have what you might say, a stronger hand. They have up to 1 million men on the ground in Iran today.
Now, there is also a divergence in terms of how the various parties view the war. As you say, Iran continues to prepare and in many ways is pursuing and continuing that war of attrition, while the White House, at least U.S. President Donald Trump, wants to wrap things up along with what the vice president said. Meanwhile, Israel is intensifying strikes with a different goal than the Americans. Talk about these various dynamics.
Well, I think what we know, based on evidence emerging from the United States and Israel, is that it was really Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Mossad who convinced President Trump that this was going to be an easy war, quick war, clean war. And President Trump was emboldened by the easy and clean victory in Venezuela. And in fact, there's a great deal of soul searching among some US officials about this particular monstrous strategic miscalculation regarding Iran. So President Trump finds himself in a strategic bind. He is entrapped. Regardless if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tried to convince him or not, he is the one who basically fell for the argument made by Netanyahu. Israel's goal is very simple. From the beginning, Israel wanted and Israel wants regime change. And now they realize that regime change is almost an impossible mission. So what they're trying to do is to destroy as much as possible of Iran's strategic infrastructure. It's not just about missiles, ballistic missiles, about the industrial base. They are now targeting universities, they're targeting steel factories. So what Israel really is trying to do is in a race against time to do as much damage to Iranian infrastructure. And this does not really cohere with American strategy, because the Iranians now, many Iranians are saying, look, you're not really waging a war against the Islamic Republic. You're waging a war against the country itself. In particular, you're trying to deindustrialize Iran and destroy its facilities and factories and power plants.
Fawaz, the Strait of Hormuz continues to be important. Tehran is allowing passage of some ships. What is the likelihood that Iran can permanently charge transit fees there? I imagine the Gulf states would not be happy.
Oh, absolutely. I think what we have seen in the past 4 weeks is that Iran has asserted its control over the Strait of Hormuz, through which 21 million barrels of oil passes every day, and similar quantities of gas and chemicals, including fertilizers. What Iran is trying to do now is to establish a system through which it could charge tolls for passing ships. And this is a massive, basically waterway. In fact, estimates say that Iran could make up to $80 billion a year, much more than Egypt does from the Suez Canal. But of course, there's a great deal of opposition, and the Gulf states are opposed, and the United States and the European powers. But this is a bargaining position. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's most potent deterrent weapons. It really has increased the pain to the world economy. It has slowed down the world economy. And its control of the Strait of Hormuz basically is a strategic advantage and a major negotiating card in its arsenal.
Right. Fawaz Gerges there, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Mairav Zonszein is senior analyst on Israel for International Crisis Group. Mairav, welcome. If the U.S. deploys ground troops, what will Israel's role be?
It's good to be with you, Melissa. I think Israel's role will primarily be to be cheering on the troops in this invasion. Israel's Air Force has been acting a lot in Iran. Israeli military intelligence probably will help out. But Israel is already, overstretched with what it's doing in Iran. It also has a war in Lebanon. It also has troops in Gaza and Syria. So, I don't think that there's going to be anything beyond what we're seeing already now in terms of Israel's cooperation.
Now, you just talked about Israel striking in Iran at a time when the White House is sending very mixed signals about what it wants. We just heard Vice President J.D. Vance there saying that this will wrap up real quick. Is this a point of tension between the two countries in terms of their differing goals?
Honestly, it's hard to know. I think, as you said, there's a lot of different rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration. Honestly, I don't take anything that they say seriously anymore. I think we need to look at what's happening on the ground. And what's happening on the ground is the moving of troops and the continued escalation by Israel primarily as well in trying to assassinate more and more Iranian leaders. I think from the outset, Netanyahu has dedicated a lot of time and effort to getting Trump to join this war, and they've launched this war together. Netanyahu probably and Trump would have liked for some kind of regime collapse. I think Netanyahu's, based on his actions, if you look at the attacks on the steel plant in Iran, the factories, and trying to hit the economy, this is more than even regime collapse. This is some kind of state collapse, chaos. This is what Netanyahu seems to be going for. And Trump, on a given day, is either going for some kind of off-ramp and diplomacy or going for escalation and trying to save face. So it's very hard to know, but I think ultimately they're still quite coordinated in what they're doing. But ultimately, Israelis, I think, understand that once Trump decides that this needs to stop, even though we don't know exactly how Iran will respond, Israel will have to fall in line.
Mairav, as we have been discussing, much attention has been focused on U.S. President Donald Trump and the fact that he changes goalposts multiple times, sometimes within 1 hour. But has Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, has his goal that he's articulated to the public in Israel, has that changed over the past few weeks?
It has shifted somewhat, but Netanyahu is very good at keeping things, somewhat nuanced. I mean, he talked about regime change and collapse many times over the course of the last few months. After the June 2025 war, they talked about it being something that would be welcome. Right now, he has specifically said, after the war started, he talked specifically about destroying, degrading, or debilitating the nuclear capabilities, the ballistic missile capabilities, and creating conditions, quote unquote, conditions for the Iranian people to change this regime. So he has not put regime change as an explicit goal. And I think that there's already been a lot of reports about some kind of abandoned plan for the Kurds to come in, and basically the understanding from the military, at least in Israel, that regime collapse is not going to happen in this specific campaign. It might be a result later on. And I think nobody really knows what the exact result or consequences of the actions now are going to be. But Netanyahu is, either way, whatever happens, he's very, very good at framing a victory narrative and coming out, somehow victorious in all of this.
Very quickly, last question. Has Israel's relations with Gulf nations changed? What are the implications moving forward?
I mean, that's also something that we have to wait and see. I mean, obviously, the Abraham Accords and the U.S. presence in the Gulf has made it the biggest target of this war. And Iran has fired a lot more at the Gulf, certainly in the beginning, than it has at Israel. I think in Israel, there's a kind of a disinformation campaign about the Gulf's interest in escalating and willingness to go further. I don't think that's true at all, but the Gulf countries are in a very difficult position, and they, like Israel in that sense, do want there to be a kind of full end to this, and meaning not to have to go through this again soon. So on that, I think they're somewhat aligned in the idea that they want there to be a final kind of blow.
Mairav, Zonszein, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.